I'm Lola and this is Ben, and we're both editors at New Left Review, here to talk about our new book, Who Will Build the Ark? Debates on Climate Strategy from New Left Review. The book is a collection of essays debating how best to decarbonise the world economy.
It might be that the easiest way to summarize the contents of the book is just to talk about how the thing was assembled or something, rather, as if you're talking about building a sandwich or something. You first, put the bottom slice of bread or something. In a way, the bottom slice of bread here is Mike Davis's great essay from which we took the title of the whole collection, Who Will Build the Ark?, in which Davis sort of stages as a debate his kind of, with himself, his, pessimism about whether the obvious problem of this kind of global environmental crisis can be solved at all with, the social forces that are on the horizon. And whether, in fact, it provides the opportunity, or whether, in fact, it provides the opportunity for a kind of revolutionary reconstitution of society. And then we get Herman Daly saying, well, basically, whatever we do, we need the society or the economy not to exist beyond certain biophysical parameters. Then we immediately have Robert Pollin querying that and saying, in fact, we want to retain growth, but it should be decarbonized as much as possible. We have Sharachandra Lele coming in and saying both of these criterion, degrowth and growth, ignore the fundamental criterion of people's well-being. And then as the book proceeds, we have a number of more sort of topical interventions about where the financing would come from a green transition. Cedric Durand talks about that. Alyssa Battistoni talks about this very disappointing Conference of the Party meeting in the 26th one, whichever year that was, but one of these recent years. And then, I shouldn't say it isn't just theory and then topical stuff, I suppose, though, because there are these really important feminist interventions from Nancy Fraser and Mary Mallour about the kind of background reproductive conditions of capital, as Nancy Fraser would put it, more or less, paraphrasing, which seem to be being undermined very rapidly, not just the ecological ones, but the issues of sort of social reproduction, a certain sort of standard of human life that's necessary to send wage laborers out there to do their socially necessary labor on a daily basis. And then there's the Mary Mallour article is difficult to summarize because it's complex, but it's a kind of a feminist argument for the socialization of finance to a great extent, so that it can promote values other than capital accumulation. And in a way partakes of kind of old-fashioned, it's an old sort of socialist maneuver to say, might there be a way in which capitalism has furnished the conditions for its transcendence? In this case, not through socializing the labor process, but through this enormous financial power that we see wielded against us on a daily basis, but might that be wielded on our own behalf? So I think that suggests something of the diversity of positions, all with something like the same goal in mind that characterizes the book.
So I think for me, what was amazing about working on this book, but also now getting to read it, is that the deep intellectual issues and philosophical issues of how we approach climate change on the left are raised throughout in really interesting ways. Mm-hmm. The degree to which sacrifice is something we should be asking of ordinary people. One way of describing the difference between some of the degrowth agendas in this book would be they're asking a lot of them for changes in lifestyle. We should consume 6 times less energy than we do. We should stop eating meat, stop flying.
The question about sort of degrowth versus green growth has a lot to do with what degree of sacrifice and sort of what is that, what is the nature of any sacrifice that would be exacted from the population, and perhaps, arguably, even from the point of view of some degrowthers, none at all. We're actually promising you a much happier life. And we can, bracket for now whether we find that case persuasive. But the biggest debate, as you're alluding to in the book, may have to do with people, starting with Herman Daly, who's like, the late Herman Daly, who is a kind of pioneer of ecological economics from whose most important work was published in 1977, it seems to me, steady state economics, which proposed that not in GDP terms, he wants to sort of set that aside, but in terms of what he calls biophysical throughput, you should have a non-growing economy past a certain point. In fact, you might get to a point where you felt that the ideal size in biophysical terms of the economy was smaller than it is now, hence degrowth. But he at least wanted to insist that the economy is not merely a matter of numbers, but it is a kind of phenomenon of natural history, even if it's a phenomenon very much controlled by human history. But it has the features of the natural world in the sense that it is of a certain size and it has a certain metabolism with other living things and with the environment generally. It is urgent that we decarbonize growth and decouple, as the literature often says, decouple economic growth from the growth of fossil fuel inputs. But that there's certainly no immediate need and maybe no ultimate need either to set aside growth, which on the whole has been a good thing. So I think this debate this is like one of the bright red threads that runs through the whole volume.
It was a kind of a secondary quite interesting question. I mean, I found interesting question about the relationship between growth and capitalism. Is a stagnant capitalism, in a sense, an oxymoron? I mean, we have seen quite a stagnant capitalism, but will a society that doesn't grow still be capitalist? That was a kind of interesting question going to the debate. But yeah, then I guess the kind of pressing question for strategy, in a sense, for example, Bob Poland would say, in an economy that's growing, then you have like more resources basically for decarbonisation. So like you can invest more. There are like it kind of speeds up the process at which kind of clean energy can replace fossil fuel. But whereas the degrowth is like there's a piece by Mark Burton and Peter Somerville, and they would say that if growth is growing, like even if growth is helping to decarbonize, in a sense, it's also at the moment extremely carbon intensive. So the more we grow, the more we consume, the more economic activity there is, the more carbon we use, the higher the hill is we have to climb, kind of thing.
The news gets worse and worse as these sort of debates proceed, and we find ourselves in talking about these things living in a kind of tournament of accelerating like deadlines. And I mean, you probably were reading in the paper the other day, as I was, that now it seems like we may have our first Arctic ice-free summer, not in 2050 or so, but in 2030. That is to say, 7 years down the line. Oh, something that I think would have shocked people, including climate scientists, a few years ago. So we find that these deadlines are both quite urgent, but also quite hypothetical. It's a bit like being a writer, right? Whatever you hear as the deadline isn't the real deadline, but that doesn't mean that deadlines don't exist.
Degrowth comes in for like quite a lot of criticism in the book, I suppose. Poland, one of the things he says about degrowth is like if you just, shrunk economies, like that would just be like tumbling living standards and recession. Like the only kind of degrowth we see is like causes severe social pain, basically. And so he thinks it's kind of like a political non-starter to be advocating that. But I also think that one great thing that the degrowth arguments in the book, they raise the question both of like what well-being is, and I guess another kind of important theme in the book is like growth becomes a bit of a euphemism for rising living standards, and like, yes, as you say, growth means the production of good things as well as bad. I mean, Daly would say that GDP is like not very loosely connected to welfare. I think Charachandra Lele also makes that case. He argues for like a much more multidimensional, rich idea of what constitutes human welfare. And so I guess one of the great things about degrowth is prompting that conversation, but also the other kinds of big structural transformations that would be required to degrow in a kind of equitable, humane way. So like decommodifying things.
Most of I think the admirable and the best degrowth literature assumes that any kind of deliberate shrinking of the economy is accompanied by a program that softens the blow to people in wealthy countries and maybe turns the blow into a caress. That probably sounds that's going a little too far. But what degrowth under capitalist kind of unreconstructed capitalist terms is simply depression, right? It's people out of work. It's people very anxious about being able to pay their bills. And since this is the way that reduced overall output is handled, generally speaking, in capitalist economies, rather than everyone doing less work, it's many people continuing to do just as much, if not more work than before, and other people being unemployed and having no work to do at all. So it seems very clear that degrowth is both practically and ideologically a non-starter without other very substantial reforms of the society and the economy, to the point that you may no longer be living in a capitalist society at all. At least you'd be living in one that was very radically changed. I think conceptually there's not a problem of retaining capitalist degrowth. Seems like, or a marketized degrowth seems conceptually conceivable. Whether it's practically imaginable or not is another phenomenon.
The final text is Tom Meaney's great piece on the Inflation Reduction Act, hailed as like the historic climate legislation passed in the US in August 2022.
Many left commentators acknowledge this is a significant piece of climate legislation, even if it's far short of any hopes and ambitions we would have. Nonetheless, this does show the kind of capitalist ruling class taking seriously the problem, or a sector of it anyway, taking seriously the problem of this sort of onrushing climate disaster. I think something you and I have talked about, and that Tom's piece really brings out, is the sort of question of what counts as realism. And it's easy at moments to read this collection and think the proponents of a Green New Deal and then a quite watered down Green New Deal, they are the realistic ones, because it looks like the goals are modest enough, and there are existing political actors, namely those already possessing power, or at least credibly aspiring toward it, basically center-left forces here and there. There's somebody who might bring about this program. But I think what the sort of degrowth side of the argument might well say, and I'm sort of sympathetic to that position, is that realism is going to change rather rapidly as reality changes rather rapidly, and we see that there's this kind of all of these sort of accelerating climate deadlines, this kind of concatenation of disasters, such that this sort of terrible hurricane in Houston that and over Houston that I refer to in my introduction to the Daily piece. This is now forgotten in like the American annal. It's like it might as well be a school shooting. Who remembers any of them? It's like we have school shootings every other week, and we have these like great big climate disasters every month. And I think as we begin to live in a world in which it becomes harder and harder for anyone to look around the world and think climate change may be a problem, but it's for other places and for different people, younger people not yet born. As it becomes harder and harder to say that, I think the criteria for political realism will probably change, perhaps in quite terrible ways, right? I mean, this is like, these changes don't automatically mean like the creation of a constituency for sort of international eco-socialism. I think it's easy enough to see the possibility of the rise, and even some sort of glimmerings of already the rise of a kind of eco-fascism, in which people's response to accelerating crisis is to even more jealously attempt to defend whatever more or less climate peace and economic prosperity they believe themselves to possess right now.
The problem of power remains like a really tenacious one that I guess no one on the left has resolved in this book, represented in this book. The question of like power, about how to decarbonize in a socialist way, as we've seen with the pandemic being one example of like a kind of unforeseen by most exogenous shock, not unrelated to climate change, obviously, and that opens up lots of political opportunities, but without programs being adumbrated, then you can't take advantage of these moments.
I mean, I wish I could quote the line exactly, but somewhere in Minima Moralia, Adorno says something like, it is not only dialectical theory, but also its absence that seizes the proletariat as a motivating force. He's like, the absence of dialectical theory, that also motivates people. So I do think, Marxism has never been certain, right, since the German ideology, to what extent. We know that ideas themselves don't shape history, but we also know, I think, that they have some role, and the size of that role is not clear. But it seems that as you see in the book, and as you bring out in your sort of the piece that's of yours that's like right at the center of the book. Growth has not just been an economic phenomenon, but an ideological phenomenon, and a premise of virtually our whole political lives, right? That everybody sort of took it for granted, whatever their politics were, that growth was necessary. So it's clear that like this idea, not just the kind of brute reality of growth, but the ideology that is growth, has been quite fundamental. And so I think it is right. It is quite important what ideas people have in their heads, and whether they perceive them to be incompatible with socialism, whether they perceive them to be compatible or incompatible with the labor movement, whether they perceive them to be, these various programs, whether growth or simple decarbonization or so, compatible with market economy, with capitalism. And I think for many years, I think it seemed like ecological politics sort of existed in a kind of separate and minor department of the left. I think it's no longer possible to feel that, that one can't just say, sure, I'm glad that the environmentalists are looking after these things, or I hope they begin to look after them better. I think it looks like right now ecological politics will be a feature of politics to core, politics in the most basic sense of the term. For the rest of this century and beyond. There are a pair of interviews in the book. The first one we've already talked about is with Herman Daly, and the other one is with Zion Lights, who at the time was a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion, who was engaged. I mean, you know better than I do, being an English woman. Engaged in these quite dramatic street demonstrations or sort of street theater, throwing tomato soup cans on works of art and so forth.
The consciousness raising of not just XR, but like the Friday strikes, of the amazing social movements, especially kind of between 2018 and 2020, have been incredibly valuable. I do think consciousness has now kind of been raised to a point, and that now we're left with the balance of power and the focus of left strategizing and reflection. I suppose it's about and I suppose not just in terms of how we assess, for example, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, it's kind of a handout to private enterprise. It's obviously mainly in the form of tax credits, and a lot of it's going to electric vehicles rather than expanding public transit and so on. But also in terms of basically how these pieces of legislation consolidate coalitions and build and create and change the balance of forces in such a way that there's ways to build upon them.
It's obviously on more minimal rather than maximal demands that one can imagine the left coming together, right? That is to say, immediate decarbonization is something that probably everybody who contributes to this book would agree to, and many people on the left. They wouldn't agree about sort of dietary politics, whether there should be mandatory veganism or whether the price of meat should just have sort of externalities factored in. So most people are going to be a vegan anyway because it will cost $85 to eat a hamburger from time to time. Those are questions I think that we're naturally not going to have so much consensus, and it seems like where there is consensus, we need to strike fast and strike hard. And but I think, as you say in what is nearly the last line of the book, mere decarbonization is not an adequate political program. None of us want to live in a world in which we think, all right, now it looks like the ecological basis of civilization has been preserved, and it's just like as mean and nasty and brutish a civilization as you could possibly imagine, but it's stable. It's been stabilized,
One thing we say in the book as well is I think sometimes the differences between like degrowth and growth philosophies can be overstated and actually are not necessarily incompatible and converge in various ways, and that you don't want to, although you do want to unpick all the differences and as a kind of important reflective exercise, you don't want to overstate them as like, we're radically incompatible views. But I do see differences in sensibility, I guess, related to, I suppose, like to sort of caricature, but like a kind of a Green New Deal like viewpoint is like mean to build new infrastructure, like build the world anew, like and certain kind of degrowth advocate emphasizes limits and about like accommodating ourselves to like a kind of imperfect and limited world. And I think sometimes I do think that kind of sensibility difference does present problems for like cohering like a movement, as you were saying, that decarbonisation is not like a sexy political program. Like you need to actually connect with people in their like material concrete life, like and that's if it's like talking about like food and housing and like shelter, but not in terms of just like greening it, but in terms of like decommodifying it, making it accessible and stuff, and making people feel more secure. And seems like a pretty universal idea on the left, and that you need to be in effect in some way soldering this like problem based on like energy supply to a much more, and this is actually in the Mike Davis piece too, but a much more capacious vision of like of human progress, basically, to have any chance. There are like obviously all kinds of like reactionary ideologies to which like decarbonisation can be soldered, as it were, and I suppose like like competition with China as like, and like nationalistic, quite dangerous nationalistic kinds of like ideas can be instrumentalized to build support for things like decarbonising the US economy in this case.
In a way, it's a nice thing to be able to wonder a little bit about whether decarbonization will be, and already is, like a kind of feature of inter-imperial rivalry. I think, the CHIPS Act of Biden is a much more aggressive piece of economic warfare than is, and so are these sort of sanction regimes that are done all the time against various like enemies of NATO and the United States. These are the much more aggressive acts of economic warfare than are, the subsidization of battery plants. Which certainly aren't exactly like neoliberal, but it's like, there's never been any kind of free market, of course, in agriculture since capitalism exists, or not at least since the middle of the 19th century. So it's I think it could be overstated to what extent the IRA, in the American sense of the Inflation Reduction Act, has become a sort of feature of Sino-American competition. I think it's that conflict, or which potentially quite sort of deadly consequences that we need to sort of worry about more directly. And I suppose I find it like a modestly hopeful sign that we can even have the problem of China and the United States competing about who can produce solar panels fastest, cheapest, and for more and more people in the world. There are obviously better ways to go about doing this, but one of the reasons it's good to have this debate on the left is so that certain decarbonization doesn't become the sort of property of the sort of bien pensant like ruling classes, who would be quite happy perhaps if they do any decarbonization at all to do it en route to sort of like global war.
I guess actually I just reminded me of one thing we probably haven't emphasized enough is that the kind of part of the range of the collection is also questioning which has actually recently, I would say, become almost beyond question somehow, but questioning the carboncentrism of like climate debate. Like, it's because of the, like, I think Sharachandra Lele especially is like, his essay is good at saying, especially in like the global south and stuff, like there are all sorts of other like way more pressing environmental issues like water stress and so on, and in general, I guess Troy brings this up, I think, in his essay too, like that, like we're just talking about, as we've been just talking about, like just it's obviously true that like weaning ourselves off fossil fuels and scaling up clean energy is like the most important thing for climate change, given like the amount that fossil fuels account for carbon emissions, but there are all sorts of other like ocean acidification and like so on, and ecosystem, and this is all this is a kind of another line in the series, I would say, is like thinking in a more holistic sense about the planet, not just as like in this like very I guess carbon-centric, also anthropocentric way about that, which is obviously has become dominant. But
and I think something that Tom's piece towards the end of Tom Meany's piece towards the end of the collection brings out quite explicitly, but that's implicit in a lot of the other pieces, is the time scales, the time frames appropriate to given policies. I think a certain type of kind of carbon centrism can be defended on the grounds of urgency. That's to say, if your leg has just been broken, you're like naturally like, sort of osso-centric, right? You're like, I'm very interested in the health of my bones. Once your leg is set and adequately healed and you can walk again, you might, you'll quickly remember that there, whether your bones are broken or not is not the only aspect of your health. And I think, perhaps this sounds sort of Pollyannish and like to resolve these problems too easily, but I find like the sort of narrower politics of a kind of social democratic Green New Deal quite appealing on the timescale of 5-10 years. We may well blow past those timelines or those deadlines. We probably will, but I also find like degrowth, which doesn't just pay attention to carbon, as you say, but to the depletion of aquifers and so forth, to biodiversity, to ocean acidification. I find that more appealing and very urgent, just slightly less so. And insofar as there's sort of any harmony of like views to be found in like or derived from a collection like this, I think it would have to do with the time frame that necessitates a given politics, because it's very clear that one wouldn't want to think all we need to worry about over the next 10, 100 or 1,000 years is that there's not too much carbon in the atmosphere. But at the same time, it seems quite it's rational to think this is what I'm most worried about right now, and probably what I'll remain most worried about for at least some years. I mean, that's probably to suggest resolving these questions sort of too easily, but I think the compatibility of these different ideas is not so much sort of in one moment of thought, but at different moments of history.
Ben wrote a beautiful preface to the collection, and I contributed an afterword, kind of reflecting on the things we've been talking about really, but trying to think about the key points of contention and how things changed over the series and in the wider world. But yeah, I guess I end on the note that I guess it's kind of what we were just talking about before about decarbonisation being has become like a very dominant political objective, but is like not like a mere survival is like quite a low bar for like our political aims, I suppose, and our aspirations for human life. So yeah, I guess I just I end the note end the book, on the note of thinking about envisioning what we want to envisage beyond I guess a carbon transition. I think sometimes like the jargon of climate politics, or of official climate politics anyway, can be quite sort of like binary. Like it's like, you know, there's like the transition, there's like the net zero, there's like this deadline. If you miss that deadline, then that, you know. And actually, obviously, like we live in like the world is gonna kind of, well, we hope, go on, and that like it's sort of like not what comes after. It's kind of, I guess, yeah, what comes after post carbon in a sense. Like, and I just suppose like I just sometimes think it's important, especially maybe reconfiguring ourselves after some successes in the form of like climate legislation, and hopefully those will only accrue over the next coming years, to think not so much about like we either fail or succeed, or we either avert climate change or not, but to think of a kind of ongoing process of shaping the world in not only ways that tilt towards clean energy, but that like tilt towards labour away from capital, and like meeting ordinary needs, ordinary human needs, and I guess about the importance of kind of vigorous and like vibrant intellectual left in animating that struggle to shape the world, basically with like ideas that are not only compelling but that really engage with each other, basically, which I guess is like, I would describe the ethos of the book as about that. I think so.
I think one of the things we wanted to we needed to think about in writing this book is to what extent it sort of caps a debate, and to what extent it actually, hopefully, is part of almost like a kind of prehistory of a like thoroughly ecological left of the future. Because I think, you know, this sort of society beyond the transition that you're talking about, I hope will be one that is not, if it ever comes to pass, not beyond the sort of revelation that the environment, the biosphere, whatever you like to call it, is the context of all of our politics. And there was a sort of terrible forgetting of this for a long time. Solving, if we ever do, the sort of carbon problem will not mean an end to sort of ecological politics. But I hope one of the things that's going on in a book like this is sort of the understanding that there's an ecological dimension to politics, you know, in the simplest sense, in the most basic sense of the term, and that we can't just sort of set that aside, neither kind of practically nor intellectually.